There was a time when a child could stand in front of a candy counter and take a full minute to decide, and nobody would hurry them along. The shelf was built low, almost like someone had measured it against a kid's height on purpose. Behind the glass, rows of paper wrappers in colors that don't exist anymore sat in perfect lines, catching the fluorescent light a certain way. And a few coins pressed warm into a small hand felt like the only decision that mattered that whole day. Almost none of what filled that shelf survived. Not because it failed, not because people stopped loving it. In most cases, nobody ever decided to stop buying it at all. It simply stopped arriving one week. And by the time anyone thought to ask why, the answer had already vanished right along with the candy. 10 of those candy bars are still out there somewhere, kept alive only in memory, even though the shelf itself has held something else for decades now. A few of them were the best-selling treats in the entire country for years at a time. And one of them is, to this day, the single most requested candy bar revival in America. It isn't the one you're picturing right now. We'll get there, but not yet, because before any of these 10 disappeared, they belonged to something. Not a store, not a company. A whole version of daily life that quietly doesn't exist anymore, and that most people haven't noticed missing until right now. A candy bar was one of the first things a kid ever bought with their own money. No parent standing over the decision. That's easy to forget now. At the time, it mattered enormously. It was practice at being a person who made choices. A nickel, then a dime, then eventually a quarter, handed across the counter to someone who usually knew your name, or at the very least, knew your order before you said it out loud. The store itself was never really a business, not in the way we'd use that word today. It was closer to a fixture of the block, the way the school was a fixture, or the church at the end of the street. The man behind the counter remembered whose kid you were. He knew which candy your older brother liked, and whether you'd try, again, to talk him into something you couldn't quite afford yet. Candy became its own kind of currency among children, long before anyone would have called it that. You traded it on the walk home. You split a bar in half with a thumbnail because nobody carried a knife, and the half you gave away always somehow tasted better than the half you kept. You showed off a rare find, a flavor nobody else's store carried, like it made you interesting for an entire afternoon. It was never really about indulgence. It was tied to routine. The walk home after school, the 10 minutes after Little League practice, still in uniform, dust on your knees. The short errand after church on a Sunday, when a nickel bought a small piece of the day that actually belonged to you. Candy didn't interrupt childhood. It was woven into the ordinary parts of it so completely that its disappearance never registered as loss while it was happening. It felt like nothing at all, right up until it felt like everything. Because here's the part almost nobody expects. Some of these candy bars didn't just fade the way you'd assume. Some of them were killed on purpose, pulled from shelves while people were still lined up buying them, decided somewhere far from the kitchens and porches and corner stores where they actually mattered, without a single person who loved them ever getting a vote. So we'll start at the beginning, not with the saddest loss on this list, with the strangest one. Long before candy bars leaned on clean, forgettable branding, one company decided the boldest thing you could print on a wrapper was the promise of an entire meal. In the 1920s, the Sperry Candy Company released a bar with a full dinner plate illustrated right on the packaging, and gave it a name that made kids laugh out loud every single time they said it: the Chicken Dinner Bar. There was no chicken in it, obviously, just caramel, roasted peanuts, and a coating of fudge, wrapped around a joke of a name that turned out to be genuinely brilliant marketing. At a time when candy competed on personality as much as flavor, something this strange was impossible to forget. Kids asked for it by name specifically because of what it was called. It survived the Depression. It survived sugar rationing during the Second World War, which is more than most candy from that era can say. It held on for nearly 4 decades, quietly loved by a generation that grew up laughing at its own joke every time a coin changed hands for it. Then, sometime in the early 1960s, it simply stopped. Not because anyone stopped liking caramel and peanuts, because the entire era of candy, built on personality and humor, gave way to something cleaner and quieter. Brand names got simpler, wrappers got glossier. A bar that made you laugh before you even tasted it started to feel oddly out of place beside candy that just told you plainly what it was. A bar named after dinner outlived 2 wars and a depression. It couldn't survive becoming ordinary. Strange names weren't the only casualty on that shelf, though. Somewhere in the middle of the lineup sat a disappearance that had nothing to do with taste at all. This one had to do with where a candy bar happened to be born. In the 1970s, Nestle introduced something unlike anything sitting near it. A bar of aerated chocolate, threaded through with tiny air bubbles that made it lighter, almost bouncy against the tongue. They called it Choco'Lite, and for the kids who tried it, the appeal was never really the flavor. It was the texture. It dissolved differently than anything else on the shelf, and that alone made it feel like a small experiment every time. Bars like it had already built devoted followings overseas, in places where aerated chocolate had been part of candy culture for years. But here, it never quite found the same foothold. It sold well enough to hang on for a while. It just never became a habit, the way its overseas cousins had. And as Nestle's American lineup narrowed toward its strongest sellers, Choco'Lite went quietly. It wasn't beaten by a better candy bar. It was beaten by distance. And distance never apologizes to the kids who loved something anyway. Somewhere else on that same shelf sat a bar that lost its life not to bad sales, but to paperwork. Peter Paul, the company behind Mounds and Almond Joy, made a layered bar called Caravelle, chocolate, caramel, and crisped rice, set apart from its softer, chewier neighbors by a texture people still describe with strange precision decades later, like they're afraid you won't believe them. It never got the marketing budget its more famous siblings did. It didn't need to. It had a quieter, loyal following that kept buying it year after year, largely unnoticed by anyone at the company itself. Then, through the 1980s, Peter Paul merged first with Cadbury and later folded into Hershey. And in the reshuffling that follows every merger like that, the less prominent names are always the first ones trimmed from the list. Nobody wrote a headline about it. Nobody ever announced that a specific crisped rice candy bar had quietly become a casualty of corporate consolidation. But for the people who'd bought it for years, one day it simply wasn't there. Replaced by bars that had already won the popularity contest a decade earlier. It didn't lose to a better candy bar. It lost to a spreadsheet. Mergers weren't the strangest reason a candy bar disappeared, though. Not even close. The next one on this list vanished because the very thing that made people love it was also the thing that made it too expensive to keep making. In the 1930s, Pearson's Candy Company had an idea that sounds almost impossible by today's standards. A single wrapper containing 7 completely different fillings. Caramel, coconut, nougat, fudge, jelly, a Brazil nut center, cherry. One bar, 7 distinct bites, engineered so that whatever a kid happened to be craving that afternoon, this one candy bar could answer it. They called it the 7-Up bar, and for the better part of 4 decades, it turned an ordinary purchase into a small act of discovery. No 2 bites ever tasted quite the same. Kids requested it specifically for the surprise of it, the way you might ask for one particular flavor of anything else. Except this bar somehow held the entire range at once. But manufacturing 7 separate fillings inside one small candy bar is exactly as complicated as it sounds. And as production costs climbed through the 1970s, that complexity stopped making sense on paper. Pearson's discontinued it in 1979. The shelf that had once held a candy bar built around variety quietly filled back in with simpler, single-flavor bars, cheaper to make, faster to sell, and far less interesting to eat. 7 flavors in one bar, one decision in a boardroom, and just like that, the surprise was gone. Efficiency ended that one. Loyalty couldn't save the next bar either. Even though its fans have spent 30 years since trying to recreate it in their own kitchens, following half-remembered instructions typed out on forums by people who still, somehow, remember the exact taste. In the mid-1980s, Hershey introduced something that didn't resemble much else in its lineup, a bar built around chocolate cake and crisped wafer, closer to dessert than candy. They called it Bar None, and it built the kind of quiet, devoted following that never quite shows up on a sales chart, but shows up unmistakably in the way people describe it decades later. Ask someone who ate it as a kid what it tasted like, and they won't give you a vague answer. They'll describe the exact texture, almost defensively, like they're bracing for you not to believe something that specific could have ever really existed. It ran for over a decade before Hershey discontinued it in 1997. narrowing its lineup toward the handful of products carrying the highest margins. And unlike some of the others on this list, nothing quite replaced it. Its cake-like texture largely vanished from American shelves entirely, leaving a gap shaped exactly like the thing that used to fill it. Some candy bars get replaced. This one just left a shape nothing else has ever quite matched. But that one disappeared quietly. The next one was killed on purpose, while people were still buying it, and 30 years later, it still makes some of them genuinely angry to talk about. In 1989, Mars released a peanut butter cookie bar coated in chocolate and called it PB Max. It built a following fast, the kind that felt less like customers and more like converts. A hearty cookie base, peanut butter, chocolate, all of it heartier than a normal candy bar, closer to something you'd actually plan around than something you grabbed on impulse on the way out of a store. By most accounts, it was still selling well in 1993 when Mars discontinued it anyway. Not because people had stopped buying it. Candy historians and longtime fans have pointed, for decades now, to the same widely reported explanation: an internal disagreement within the Mars family itself, one that had nothing to do with the bar's popularity and everything to do with a decision made somewhere far above the people who loved it. It didn't fail. It simply stopped existing, and no one who actually ate the thing ever got a vote in that. A candy bar people still miss on purpose is rare enough on its own. But the next one is tied to something even bigger than taste. It's tied to an entire American pastime, and its disappearance says something quiet about how fame itself has changed since. In 1978, a candy bar hit shelves named after a living baseball player, Reggie Jackson, fresh off leading the Yankees to a World Series. They called it simply the Reggie Bar, exclamation point printed right there on the wrapper. And on opening day that same year, in one of the strangest and most joyful moments in baseball folklore, fans at Yankee Stadium threw thousands of them onto the field the instant Jackson hit a home run in his very first at-bat of the season. Chocolate and wax paper raining down onto a baseball field, because a whole stadium felt exactly the same thing at exactly the same second. For a generation of kids, that candy bar was never really about what was inside the wrapper. It was about being a baseball fan during one specific season, tied to one specific stadium, wrapped around one specific hero. Eating it felt like holding a small piece of something much bigger than yourself. Fame like that never holds still, though. As Jackson's career wound down through the early 1980s, the charge behind the bar faded right along with it, and it disappeared from shelves not long after. Nothing replaced it in quite the same way. Modern athlete endorsements moved almost entirely into shoes, apparel, streaming deals. The specific, almost innocent idea of naming a whole candy bar after one player's love for one city simply doesn't happen anymore. For one season, a candy bar and a home run swing were the exact same memory. Neither one lasted. That kind of fame faded on its own, the way fame usually does. The next candy bar's disappearance is tied to something far more personal than baseball, though. It's tied to love itself, and to a bar millions of people still buy today without any idea what it quietly replaced. Back in the 1930s, Hershey introduced a dark chocolate bar wrapped around a soft caramel center and gave it a name meant to be said out loud to somebody else. Forever Yours. It was never sold as an everyday snack. It was sold, quite deliberately, as a small romantic gesture, something you gave to someone, not something you grabbed for yourself on the way home. For decades, it held a steady, modest place on shelves, especially around Valentine's Day, tied to specific people and specific moments in a way most candy bars never bothered trying to be. Hershey eventually discontinued the original bar in the 1990s, but this is the one disappearance on the entire list that almost nobody noticed, because what replaced it was so seamless that the feeling itself simply changed names. Much of what Forever Yours stood for, the dark chocolate, the romantic framing, the sense of a treat meant to be given rather than eaten alone, carried directly into the launch of what we now know as the Dove chocolate brand. A candy bar named Forever didn't actually last forever, but somehow what it meant to people never really left the shelf. It just started wearing a different wrapper. Which brings us, finally, to the one bar on this entire list that generates more longing, more petitions, more precise memories than the other 9 combined. a candy bar so distinctive that people who haven't held one in over 40 years can still describe it down to the wrapper. In 1973, Mars released something unlike anything else on the shelf, a long, braided rope of caramel wrapped in milk chocolate, sold in a wrapper nearly 8 inches long, with an actual printed ruler running down one side. They called it the Marathon Bar, and it turned an ordinary piece of candy into something closer to an event. Kids traded bites off it the way you'd share something rare. They measured their own height against the ruler printed right there on the wrapper, half joking, half genuinely curious. Eating it took longer than any other candy bar allowed, and that alone made it feel different every single time. It lasted less than a decade. By 1981, as candy manufacturing shifted hard toward standardized, cost-efficient shapes, an 8-inch braided rope of caramel became almost impossible to justify on a spreadsheet, no matter how many kids loved it. Mars pulled it from American shelves for good. A similar braided bar called Curly Whirly kept going in the UK. Its American cousin never came back. Of every candy bar on this list, Marathon is the one people ask about the most, not with vague nostalgia, but with real stubborn specificity. The exact length, the exact texture, the exact feeling of stretching one piece of candy out longer than it had any right to last. Decades of petitions and forum threads and half-serious campaigns have named it again and again as the one discontinued candy bar Americans most want back. It was measured in inches. It's remembered in decades, and it remains to this day the candy bar this country never actually stopped asking for. None of these 10 disappearances were really about candy. Not one of them. They were about a version of childhood that's become almost unreachable now. The low shelf at a store that knew your name, the coins counted out slowly because the decision actually mattered, the walk home split in half with a friend using nothing but a thumbnail. A whole way of being a kid quietly wrapped itself around 10 pieces of candy. And when the candy disappeared, so did the version of daily life that used to hold it. People rarely miss the product. They miss the afternoon it belonged to. The shelf might still be there. The store might even still be standing, in some form, in some town. But the version of you who once stood in front of it, deciding between 10 candy bars with a fistful of coins and all the time in the world, that's the one thing on this entire list that never came back.